Okay, well, Bilavanaka, everyone. Welcome back to the Civic Update, to our afternoon session on the second day. I'm Stephen Howes, Director of the Development Policy Centre, and I am straight away going to hand over to Ryan. Ryan's Deputy Director at the Development Policy Centre, as economist, works a lot on the Pacific and has put together this session, is chairing it, and he's going to close as well. So that's it from me. Enjoy the session. I'm sure it'll be great. And I'll just say, do turn on your videos, take part in this. We have a lot of people on Facebook just watching, but you have the opportunity to take part, and do ask questions either through the chat function or put up your hand under the reactions icon. If you click on that, you'll find a little hand, and then we'll take a question. So enjoy the session. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. Before we start, I would first like to acknowledge and to celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands I'm broadcasting from today. As Stephen mentioned, I am Ryan Edwards. I'm Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre here at the ANU and one of the co-organisers for this year's update. A big thank you for joining us for the economics session today. And just a brief reminder that this is being broadcasted and recorded live on our Facebook page, if you'd like to watch it there. We have a great cross-section of both topics and presenters in our three presentations now, starting with Liz Pechan from the International Finance Corporation. Liz is based in Vanuatu. She'll be discussing the private sector in the pandemic, focusing on Vanuatu. After Liz, Chris Hoy from the World Bank will talk about cash transfers in the region. And we will then conclude with Janesh Sami from the University of South Pacific, our partner in organising and hosting these events, who will provide an update on the current challenges in the Fijian economy and the path to recovery. Each speaker will have around 15 minutes to present and then 5 minutes after to take questions. Please do post your questions in the chat, or even better, raise your hand near the end of the talk using the raise hand function that you'll see in your Zoom interface. You are free, however, to post questions throughout the chat, but we will aim to address them all at the end. Now, over to Liz for the first presentation.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Ryan. Hi from Port Vila, from Vanuatu. My name is Liz Pechan, and I'm the Country Officer for IFC here in Vanuatu. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on the Vanuatu private sector. But before I start, can someone just let me know that you can see my screen?
Yep,
great. Thank you very much. And just bear with my eye movements. I'm dealing with a couple of multiple screens. All right. So, many of us are familiar with the role of the private sector in any national economy, and the private sector is essential for development and lifts the economy. The private sector, as we know, is an important part of job creation. It's the largest formal employer in Vanuatu. It also strengthens infrastructure and innovation. It contributes to government revenue, builds country capacity and productivity, supports trade activities, and investment in communities through its long value chains. The private sector occupies spaces where the government cannot. And here in Vanuatu, it is through both the formal and informal sectors. And you can see from the slides that the informal economic sector in Vanuatu has a large footprint. And whilst government policies have focused on formalising this sector as part of the private sector growth strategy, linking it to revenue-making efforts for government, so trying to move the informal sector to the formalised part. So my presentation is going to speak to the role of the private sector in job creation and employment, and the number of businesses operating in Vanuatu, and in turn who contribute to government revenue. So let's have a look at the Vanuatu private sector landscape pre-COVID. There's some clear growth in the formal private sector. We can see in 2010, it went from 1,903 businesses registered to just over 4,000 in 2019. So clear growth there. Data collected in 2019 relates only to the formal sector, as the Vanuatu government's business registration that I just mentioned, incentive programs with the informal sector, was still rolling out. So let's have a look at some of the trends. The dominant sector, as you can see in that block red, was with retail, hospitality and tourism, and its value chain, which also spans into the informal economic sector. The transport, which is in purple, is the next dominant sector, noting that it's quite closely linked to tourism. Formal business registrations in the productive sector, which you can barely see here right up the top, have always been really low due to the scale of commercialised farming, which is, although typically this productive sector is highly informal. So during COVID, data is quite sporadically collected, and some of the indicators that we look at are business closures, permit numbers, whether they go up or down, non-performing loans at the bank, and so on. While the data is not fully available across all sectors at the time of this presentation, there was a 2020 survey of COVID's impacts on the most dominant sector, tourism, which has highlighted significant job losses and reports imminent business closure. This is quite a busy slide. Take your time to have a look at it. When we consider the private sector's important role in job creation and employment, Vanuatu's pre-COVID employment statistics paint a picture of really high labour underutilisation, with almost 50% of our working age population outside of the paid labour force. This is exactly why growing the private sector is important in Vanuatu, because we need to create jobs. The population outside of this paid labour force is defined as students and those in unpaid domestic work, and as you can probably imagine, this is really highly gendered. In 2019, the same year indicated in this slide, the Vanuatu government launched its first ever National Human Resources Development Plan, otherwise known as the NHRDP. It estimates 8,229 people of this employed labour force that are in the public sector. So it's safe to say that the rest are in the private sector, okay? So that's about some 76,000 people. And in this same report, VNPF, which is the National Provident Fund, stated that the formal private sector provided up to around 26,000 jobs pre-COVID. So again, like I keep saying this, but data is pretty patchy, but that means that 50,000 jobs are pretty much in the informal sector. So another factor in this employment image is the Vanuatu government's labour mobility policy and arrangements with the international private sector in New Zealand and Australia, who have become an important source of employment since 2007 under various seasonal worker schemes. This continues during COVID, and let me give you a sense of scale of labour mobility for Vanuatu's employment figures. Even during COVID, numbers are pretty healthy, and they're just under 4,000 for Ni Vanuatu currently abroad. But just to give you a sense of what it has been since 2007, there have been 22,000 workers cycled through Australia and 52,000 cycled through New Zealand since 2007. So labour mobility for the international private sector has been the largest job creation exercise in all of Vanuatu. So what have been the changes to Vanuatu's private sector employment landscape since COVID? The pie chart shows pre-COVID employment by economic sector. You can see the services sector in yellow, namely tourism and financial services. This occupies 50% pretty much of private sector employment, while agriculture, forestries and fisheries in the dark green, that's 37%. And the industry sector, which includes construction, was only 8.9%. It should again be noted that at the time of this data reporting in 2019, a number of major government infrastructure projects were either between phases or still in design development or procurement processes. So during COVID, data is ad hoc, it's limited, we know that, and it relies heavily on business level data. A couple of informative surveys were undertaken in 2020 though to explore the changing private sector employment. One of them has been the VTO, the Vanuatu Tourism Office sector survey, which was conducted in April 2020. And I know that was really just after borders closed in Vanuatu, but then it was then conducted again in August 2020, reporting 3,000 losses in just that short time. The Chamber's Economic Outlook report from September 2020 confirmed the same, that tourism and hospitality sectors is most drastically hit, as well as other service categories reporting 41% job losses. The industry sector had an initial 28% job loss stumble due to the delays in those major infrastructure projects that I spoke about earlier. This has been regained though earlier this year in 2021. With support of the EU's 11th EDF announced a $4 billion support program to the productive sectors with anticipated positive impact on job creation and employment, particularly in this productive sector, which is high in self-employment. Overall, noting that official data collected has been relatively scant, estimated job losses across all industries are probably much, much higher than recorded. So Vanuatu hasn't had a community outbreak of COVID. Therefore, businesses have not had to shut down due to COVID. So only tourism and its value chain have been decimated. Other businesses are thriving whilst we are free of COVID community cases. Construction and its value chain, for example, are thriving. This is indicated by the soaring number of concrete bags imported and sold, most likely because government projects are being implemented. So to give you a sense of the impact of the prolonged COVID-related border closures on Vanuatu's private sector, here is data from the Chamber at business level across a range of industries. It highlights the impact on the role that the private sector is able to play in terms of job creation and government revenue. Again, note that this data was collected August 2020, slightly over a year ago and less than 6 months into the pandemic. So it's therefore estimated that the impact by the end of 2020 and 2021 will be far greater in those international dependent sectors like accommodation, food services, and also areas that rely on international expertise like education, health, and ICT. So the deep business ecosystem of tourism rested on an extensive supply chain spanning informal and formal economic actors. And, you know, like a house of cards, the loss of business revenue and jobs in this tourism ecosystem tumbled in 2020, and with a few hotels only remaining even to this day as quarantine facilities. Other business categories like agriculture, construction, fisheries, they're less likely to have impact, particularly once government support programs and infrastructure projects roll out. So here again, you can see the mixed economic impacts of the pandemic in the different business categories. I guess of particular interest to me is, if you see third from the right, is the transport sector. And this is primarily due to the reduced air travel in general, as well as the absence of tourism to utilise the land transport. All right, my apologies for this slide, guys. Sorry, it's blurred lines, but I guess it's an adaptive recovery story, which is also blurred. Vanuatu is also the most vulnerable country in the world to natural disasters. It's not really a tag that we like. The World Bank Risk Index has told us this. And on top of COVID, which has impacted businesses, Vanuatu has faced compounding disasters. So we had Category 5 TC Harold, and we also had a volcanic ashfall in 2020. So the government developed this Vanuatu recovery strategy, 2020 to 23, called Yumi Everyone Together, or in English, it's Work Together, to chart a roadmap through these compounded vulnerabilities. When we consider the GDP per capita decline of approximately 11% in 2020, it's a significant reflection of these compounding crises with business closure, fewer jobs, less income generated per capita, and therefore the less ability to service loans. Banks have reported rising numbers in non-performing loans at both individual and business levels. Fewer people are borrowing because they simply cannot service loans, which contribute to an overall drop in the economy. It's really, really difficult to have private sector growth in a pandemic. However, it's generally accepted that a dynamic private sector is what will get Vanuatu's economy through this pandemic. The Vanuatu government has recognised this in this strategy document you can see on this slide. And so there's been a number of measures to support the role of the private sector, which includes an economic stimulus package, such as a wage subsidy and a small business grant to support job security. There have been bank loan holidays to support business survival. And there is talk of a tourism business support program 2021 to also support business survival. This is yet to be realised. There is also the Industry Development Fund to build the manufacturing sector and strengthen the value chain through import substitution. So in 2019, ADB's Outlook Vanuatu chapter asserted that growth is expected to remain stable in 2019 and 2020 as tourism benefits from the completion of major infrastructure projects, inflation will ease further, and the current account will remain in surplus. with increased tourist arrivals, and policies must ensure that benefits are broadly enjoyed and sustained. However, by mid-2020, the reality of this was really different. In 2020, the World Bank reported a contraction of 9.2%. And for those of you watching, just keep in mind that different agencies have different figures for this figure. This is the one that I've chosen to use for this presentation. As previously mentioned, the Chamber reported highlighted contraction, which meant widespread job loss, significant decline in business revenue, loss of business confidence, and forecast of further business closure. The commercial banks also reported that lending in 2020 was at an all-time low, and economic activity had slowed considerably. At the same time, though, the Ministry of Finance reported a savings glut and a revenue surplus, and the central bank reported healthy reserves. The government business support programs and economic stimulus programs were identified as critical to slow any further decline in growth. However, on its own, it's still insufficient to support such a leap in economic recovery. The Reserve Bank of Vanuatu forecasted a V-shaped recovery to Vanuatu's GDP growth beyond 2020. And this recovery is attributed to the mobilisation of manufacturing and infrastructure projects that were delayed in 2020 due to COVID, as well as some gains from agriculture and services. It also assumes a relaxing of travel restrictions and existence of a vaccine travel bubble to aid economic recovery efforts. So, what might the future hold for Vanuatu's private sector? Where is there a need to do more for economic activity and recovery? The government has implemented a number of private sector support initiatives, which I mentioned, in the productive, the industry and the tourism sectors. And this is enabling a degree of employment stabilisation and business continuity, although there is a need to harness the growing informal economic sector in support of formal growth. However, based on current trajectories and government revenue data, a greater push is needed to catapult Vanuatu away from economic precipice towards private sector-led growth. Agriculture is a 2 to 3 year estimate for initial returns on investment. So despite the major hit by COVID to Vanuatu's private sector, there are positive signs of macroeconomic recovery and a clear government enabling environment for private sector recovery. The challenge is, and this is the take home for me for this session, is that the challenge in Vanuatu will be transferring the positive opportunities from the macro level to the microeconomic or business level. The private sector's role in domestic employment remains significant, with labour mobility only able to partially address Vanuatu's rising unemployment. The health of government revenue is currently cushioned by the Popular Citizenship Program, although thresholds are still to be determined, and private sector-based contributions remain a valuable element of growing overall revenue. International trade remains heavily dependent on global regional transport lanes and affordability, particularly now. And although market access provisions and government industry development grants are doing valuable preparatory work to support Vanuatu's private sector to engage as opportunities are arising. So private sector growth in a country like Vanuatu is a really delicate balance of a positive business enabling environment and access to capital. In 2020, Vanuatu, together with a range of economic stimulus packages and incentives, is creating a very positive enabling environment for the private sector that should be acknowledged. Access to capital is where IFC can potentially assist, and the challenge will be the threshold and matching things to scale. So the last slide speaks to itself, but it's underpinned by trusted partnerships. And Ryan, I think I'll stop here, and I just want to thank you very much, everybody, for making the time and for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Liz. We are at time, so if you do have a question for Liz, please do raise your hand or pop it into the chat box, and I will come to you. I'll start by just saying that I think that was a great update for the update that kind of continues our tradition of at least providing some updates on the economies, and did really give a nice introduction and scene setting for the next two talks that we're going to see. I found it particularly striking the size of the downturn that you're seeing there in Vanuatu, even without the lockdown. So that's going to put into context what Janesh is going to talk about later for Fiji. And it was also, not a surprise to any of us who work on labour mobility, but also your numbers showing that the labour mobility programs had really been the biggest job creation exercise in the country. That was kind of my two biggest takeaways. Do you have maybe a question from me? Do you have many thoughts and reflections on how the labour mobility programs are affecting private sector growth and domestic employment generation? Is it largely a positive, or is it more of a gap filling exercise?
Ryan, I think I'm going to answer with, it depends who you speak to. You know, if Vanuatu is losing skilled people in the electricity sector, for example, then they might not be so happy. But if you're speaking to somebody in tourism who, is unable to provide that job to someone right now, and somebody can get some income and employment elsewhere, then they're happy. So, but overall, I think, jobs is the bottom line, and being able to find a job in this pandemic is something that is needed. So I feel like it's good for the private sector, but again, it depends which sector and person you're speaking with.
I'm still looking for questions. I'm encouraging people strongly. Please do participate and don't be a stranger if you do have anything. Well, we are past the 20-minute mark. So with that, I will hand over to Chris Hoy, who will talk to us about cash transfers and social protection in the region.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to come present here today. And I am conscious of the time, so I'm going to dive straight into it. I need to start off with all the appropriate caveats, right? And so first of all, this is preliminary findings. Second of all, I'm talking about poverty in terms of monetary poverty, but obviously poverty is so much broader than that, right? So I kind of just want to make that clear from the beginning. Next thing I want to highlight is I'm talking about cash transfers, and I'm specifically talking about transfers to households that the World Bank deems as social assistance, right? So that's meant to support the consumption of households directly. So as opposed to more broader sort of ideas that people might have, like agricultural subsidies, that's kind of in a different sort of category. So I'm just focusing on cash transfers now. And then finally, I guess I just need to highlight that I'm kind of comparing across different types of cash transfers as if the objective was to reduce poverty. But obviously, cash transfers have a whole range of different objectives, right? But we're just honing in on that particular objective right here. And then the final thing I need to say is that I'm drawing on recent data from 4 large countries in the Pacific Islands. So collectively, they make up over 60% of the population of Pacific Island countries. But I kind of really don't want us to focus on any particular country. The idea here is to identify general principles we should be thinking about. And this is particularly in light of the fact that it's actually happening prior to COVID, but COVID's really sort of ramped this up, a great deal of interest among governments in the Pacific of actually maybe we do need to be looking to cash transfers as a way to support households. And if you look at the Pacific in a global context, it's very far behind, actually, a very low share of government spending and GNI is actually spent on anything which you would call a cash transfer. So you can be thinking about this in the sense that maybe the Pacific's looking to actually get closer to the global average in terms of amount of money that's spent on cash transfers. There's interest now because of the impact of COVID. And then that kind of, the question you have sort of facing as a policymaker is, well, how would you go about expanding cash transfers? Like what would be the way that you would do that to maximize the amount of poverty reduction you can achieve? And that's what I'll sort of be addressing. Now, so I'm kind of making a number of general statements, and I kind of want to highlight that it's country-specific things are important, and maybe you can bring them up in the question time or send me an email, but I'm kind of wanting to identify general principles. And in general, there are 2 main ways that cash transfers are provided, right? There is categorical cash transfers and then there's consumption-based cash transfers. And this is how you target it. So for categorical targeting, you'd say like, we're going to focus on providing a payment to elderly people, right? Consumption targeting is saying, okay, we want to provide a payment towards poorer households. And that's actually more complicated because how do you identify poorer households? And this sort of work hasn't really been done very much in the Pacific, sort of until very recently it started to expand. But prior to that, really, Fiji was one of the sort of real leaders in the region by actually having a payment that was targeting the poorest 10% of households. And efforts are made to try and identify those households using household income and expenditure surveys by observing the assets and characteristics of those households, and then trying to kind of create a system called a proxy means test, whereby you estimate whether a household is in the poorest 10% or not. And these sort of approaches come with errors. So while categorical targeting, which is far more common in the Pacific, it's pretty obvious whether someone's elderly or not. I mean, maybe that's not, I think you get the general sense, right? For consumption targeting, it's a little harder to really know whether someone's in the 10th percentile or the 12th percentile. This is sort of a bit harder, and there are lots of errors associated with this, right? But what I'm kind of looking at when I'm talking about these sort of two different ways you'll provide cash transfers, these are ways that exist in the region. So in terms of categorical targeting, there's each of these sort of categories exist in the region. And then in terms of consumption targeting, we have the case of Fiji, focusing on the bottom 10%. And then there's also some types of payments that exclude the richest households. So anyway, that's kind of just give you an idea. There's consumption targeting, there's categorical targeting. And recently you may have heard a lot of debate around the idea of a universal basic income, right? Or sort of some kind of universal payment where all households receive the same amount of money. And that's another way in which you could theoretically expand cash transfers in the region. So with that in mind, we want to be able to answer three key questions. That is, among the categorical cash transfers, which ones have the biggest impact on poverty? The next one being, if you were to implement consumption targeting, how much more poverty reduction would that result in relative to categorical targeting? But we know that consumption targeting has a lot of errors, or can have errors, right? So really the question is actually more like, how large an error, right? How large a targeting error would would result in similar levels of poverty reduction to a categorical targeting estimate? So anyway, I'll clarify that, and we can, so that as we go on in the presentation, if you have particular questions, more than happy to sort of answer that. And finally, kind of there's this idea of like, okay, once you've figured out which type of cash transfer you want to provide, the question is, what share of the population should you be covering? And that's kind of, and to what extent are there diminishing returns to covering a narrow share of the population versus a larger share? And the thing is, all of these are empirical questions, right? You can't answer this in theory. You can't answer this even necessarily based upon experience. You can't even necessarily answer this by looking at what is the case in other regions, because the Pacific Island countries are different, right, to other regions, right? And you need data to be able to answer this. And for the first time ever, we actually have data collected in the 4 countries that I'm looking at in this, using the same methodology, all collected in 2019, 2020, just prior to COVID. So this is the first time we can actually answer some of these key questions facing policymakers. And then, so what are the answers? Oh, I managed to skip over the actual pivotal slide, right? Yeah. So what are the answers? Right. So some types of categorical cash transfers, right, such as an elderly pension, do not reduce poverty as much as if you just gave the same. So I'm keeping the overall budget size constant here, right? So if you had, say, 1% of GNI to spend, would you give that money to just the elderly through an elderly pension? Or would you divide it equally among all households, which would result in more poverty reduction? It would actually be the universal transfer. So in other words, if your objective is poverty reduction, it's hard to really justify an elderly pension, right? There's a whole bunch of better ways to provide the payment. Now, if you were to provide sort of a categorical payment, what would be the way that would have the biggest impact on poverty? It would be by providing payments to households in rural areas or those with children. The second point here is that consumption targeting will have a much bigger impact on poverty than categorical targeting. And a lot of people will be sitting there saying, obviously, that's not a surprise. But what kind of is notable about this work that we've done is we highlight that even if there's very large targeting errors, so even if you could only reach 40%, say, of the bottom 10% of households, you would still result in considerably more poverty reduction than any type of categorical transfer. So that's quite sort of an important sort of takeaway. And then further to that, we do some of the analysis to show that reaching 40% through a proxy means test, as I mentioned earlier, is very achievable with this data in the Pacific. So we run a whole heap of scenarios and illustrate that that's very achievable. And then finally, here there are significant diminishing returns. And so what that means is that if you were going to ramp up your spending on cash transfers, you should really be targeting a larger share of the population, right? So if you were going to use consumption targeting, for example, if you're going to spend a couple of percent of GNI or even more than 1% of GNI, you should really be thinking about beyond just the bottom 10%. And in the remaining 5 minutes I have, I'm going to try and explain, or 5 minutes prior to questions, I'm going to try and explain how we reach these conclusions, right? And show you some graphs to support it. But I guess I'll just put in a plug that obviously in 15 minutes, you can't cover all the analysis we've done. And yeah, forthcoming, we'll have a much more detailed report covering this. So what we do is we use micro simulations whereby we're estimating the impact on $3.20 poverty. So using the international poverty line, we look at scaling up transfers. So this is all additional spending based upon the status quo. We use the household income and expenditure surveys. As I mentioned, this is a big deal that we actually have all this data collected in a cross-country comparable way for the first time in the Pacific. It's remarkable. It's exciting. This is really like a game changer in the region. And then finally, sort of in terms of incorporating targeting errors, we sort of consider two scenarios. One, which is like pretty optimistic, which is sort of being shown to be what's possible elsewhere in the world, whereby you actually reach 80% of households that you're trying to cover. And then sort of we have like a conservative scenario where we say, what if you could only reach 40%? And as I mentioned, we show actually reaching 40% is very achievable based on this data. So I'm going to skip through so many slides in the next few minutes, but I want to kind of draw to the end where there's important sort of policy implications. So when we do these micro simulations, we have to factor in a number of things. Right? So we have to look at the depth of poverty for each of these categories. We have to look at what share of the population falls into those categories. And we also have to think about how much money you're giving to the people. But when we're comparing across different types of cash transfers, what's really important is we keep the overall budget amount the same, right? Because obviously, if you spend more money, you're probably going to reduce poverty more, right? So you have to keep the budget the same and say within a fixed budget, what's the optimal way, or how can you maximize poverty reduction? Right, so just quickly, I want to show you the example here of Vanuatu. If you spent 0.5% of GNI, it comes out very clearly in terms of the percentage point reduction in $3.20 poverty gap. And we focus on the poverty gap, and I can answer in the Q&A why. Rural payments or payments to children would actually have a bigger impact than other types of transfers. What's notable probably is that there's actually not that huge a difference, right? As soon as you start spending more than 0.5% of GNI, there is, and I'll show you that shortly. This pattern exists in Vanuatu, holds across all the other countries as well. So what's the takeaway there? As I mentioned, elderly pensions really aren't performing as well as if you just gave money equally to all households, whereas payments to households with children or those in rural areas, far more promising impact on poverty. Second question, what about consumption targeting? Well, let's go back to Vanuatu. For the same amount of money, right? If you were to target, say, the bottom 10%, and this is under the conservative scenario, right? So this is saying even if you could only reach 40% of households in the bottom 10%, what would be the impact on $3.20 poverty. Well, you know, this is percentage point reduction here, but I guess the key thing to note is that we're talking about, for the bottom 10% at least, twice as much amount of poverty reduction as the best performing categorical payment, right? Potentially 3 times as, like in the order of 3 times as much as an elderly pension. And that is with a 40% error, right? So it really gives you an order of magnitude as to just how clearly consumption targeting dominates over categorical targeting. So this same pattern holds across countries. You can trust me. If you don't trust me, you can read it in the report. Right? And we also make all this data publicly available so you can do the data analysis for yourself. So key takeaway, consumption targeting clearly triumphs over categorical targeting. Right? And then finally, this idea of diminishing returns. And this chart, I'm using the example here of Kiribati. Right? You can see in the case of if you're targeting the bottom 10%, clearly dominates over all the other types of transfers. But there's huge diminishing returns. So if you're going to scale up, and in the case of the Pacific, you would think about scaling up to be far more than 0.5% of GNI to get the Pacific more in line with the rest of the world when it comes to cash transfers. You would maybe think to yourself, maybe the bottom 10% is not the best way to spend this money. Right? Same pattern holds across countries with its diminishing returns. So where does this leave us? Well, I've tried to summarize in a very crude, and this is an oversimplification of the real world, but that's part of what economics does, right? We want to try and get some crude key principles to think through. And it kind of summarizes the results whereby, you know, if you're only going to spend a little bit of money and you are going to go consumption targeting route, well, then do target the poorest 10%. If you're going to spend more than sort of 0.5%, very quickly, you might think about targeting the poorest 20% or maybe even more, right? If you were going to use categorical targeting, it makes a lot of sense to target households with young children and those in rural areas, right? It's really hard to justify an elderly pension based upon a poverty reduction motivation. And I guess just to sort of finally sort of illustrate here, I mean, I covered a lot of content in 15 minutes, but I kind of want to tease out this trade-off between a categorical payment and a consumption payment just a little bit more. Right? And kind of what I want to show you is this is a typical way in which the World Bank communicates to countries about the trade-offs between benefit levels, right? And they talk about how much would the transfer, so the actual amount of cash be as a share of your consumption, your household consumption. And if we're talking about 0.5% of GNI and you targeted the poorest 10% of households, that would be the equivalent of 25%, or 27% of household consumption, right? So that's quite a significant payment, right? And you've got to, and I'm talking about household consumption here for the poorest quintile. Right? If you were to target households with young children or those in rural areas, you would be giving them 1/5 the size of the payment. So the trade-off really here is, yes, you can get categorical targeting, you can reduce poverty, that's great. Even the best performing categorical targeting, you can reduce poverty a lot, right? It's because of the large coverage and because of the large inclusion of households that aren't poor, right? You actually get a much smaller benefit level being provided to households. And I think this really clearly illustrates this trade-off. I'll pause
we're
now.
at time, so
Yep.
let's start to wrap up.
Yeah, and that was it. So
cool.
Cool.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Chris. Do we have any questions to cut to straight away? Again, I'm not even sure if the raise hand function is working because I'm not seeing any come up. I see one long question from Marita, which I will mention. Marita, would you like to say your question verbally or should I just read it? Since we've got you on the line. I will read it. Marita says, really interesting listening in and reflecting on the way in which cash transfers have been used in Fiji in relation to the pandemic and the narrative around people not cheating the system to the point where I feel like sometimes we lose the overall policy objective of getting cash to people who need it. Recent transfers, excluding the general social welfare payments, are also not accessible to rural and remote communities, particularly those that don't have reliable internet connectivity. Did your study look at the politics of cash transfers at all and the way that that influences their use?
Yep, I mean, I'll cut to the chase. And the thing is that what I'm providing you with here is a sort of technical assessment, or a technocrat's sort of take on this, because we have data available for the first time and we can make some of these sort of comparisons. Now, that is still quite valuable, because what it does is it illustrates the opportunity cost of some of these political decisions. Right? So while we don't look directly at the sort of some of the political economy, that's what other work is looking at. I do think we pretty clearly convey some points here around, say, a decision to focus on an elderly pension, right? That might be more politically palatable, but the trade-off is you're going to have at least 1/3 of the impact on poverty as what you would if you had a consumption target. So that's kind of like, there's separate work that needs to focus on that politics, but this provides an order of magnitude as to just how large some of those political trade-offs are. And for the first time, we actually have that.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Next question we have is from Nilesh.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Hi, Christopher. Interesting study. And thanks for the study, given that the magnitude of the data that's required plus the empirical challenges. I'd be interested in seeing how the transfers were recorded and how you measured the poverty impact after the transfers, because if you give some money to a household and you capture it in a survey, it'll definitely show an increase in income. So basically, if someone is attempting to cover the poverty gap by giving some amount of money, and if you give it to a lower level, say the bottom 10%, very little would be captured. But if you say just below the poverty line, then you would see a jump in household incomes. So from another perspective, how was poverty rate looked at? Whether it was a sustained change in poverty or just a household increase in income because of a one-off transfer? Thanks.
Yep, no, great question. I'm conscious of the time, and I'll just answer it as honestly as possible, which is, so what we're presenting here is talking about, say, an ongoing transfer that you would provide to households in the order of 0.5% to 1.5% of GNI annually, right? That is that is actually, even if you gave 0.5%, most Pacific island countries would actually still be below the global average, right, when it came to cash transfers. So we're talking about an ongoing payment, and then we'll make everything available for you to be able to replicate the methodology that we did in terms of calculating the poverty line.
Cool. Big thank you, Chris and Nilesh. And
Thanks.
with that, I will hand over to Janesh Sami from University of South Pacific, who will give our final presentation for this session.
Right, Ryan, are you able to see the slides?
Yes, that's perfect. And we can hear you well.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm quite excited to join you guys and talk about Fiji's macroeconomy and the path to recovery. I think this discussion has been quite necessary, particularly because we have not had a national level discussion as to how we can have macroeconomic recovery in light of the challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm Janesh from School of Accounting, Finance and Economics. And so if you look at the presentation, I'll give a brief outline of the state of the economy, then I'll touch upon the budget. And a big part of my presentation will focus on macroeconomic recovery. And I'll briefly talk about some of the challenges for macroeconomic recovery, which is quite useful for us to know, particularly because if you look ahead, things are not going to be very straightforward. So if you look at the state of the economy, one of the major sectors that have been very seriously affected has been the tourism sector. If you look at the data on tourism earning, what we can note is that tourism earnings have increased significantly since 2010. And if you look at the data for 2018 and 19, tourism has brought around $2 billion for Fijian economy. But as a result of the pandemic, there has been about 85% decline in the tourism earning, and that's going to have a very major impact on the economy. So 85% decline in tourism earning, you can imagine the impact on the tourism sector and the spillover effect on the other related sectors. If you look at the growth aspect, what we can see is we have experienced a negative growth of 15.7% in 2020, and moving forward, things are going to be quite challenging. Now, if you look at the bars on the side, what we can note is to take our GDP back to a pre-COVID level, that's going to take 3 to 5 years. And our analysis suggests that it's going to take 3 years if the growth rate is 7% per annum. And it's going to take 5 years if the growth rate is 5% per annum. Now, is this economically possible is the question that is relevant in this particular context. Now, that again depends upon opening of the international border, to the extent to which we are able to bring in tourists, the economic and the political environment, the amount of confidence that we have in the system. If you look at the government's revenue has been significantly affected as well. There has been a decline of more than 50%. So you can imagine the impact on the fiscal policy. And in light of that, despite that, you have the government spending money to support the poor and the vulnerable, and that has affected public debt. And it's not surprising in light of this decline in revenue, public debt has gone up because the government has to borrow. Another important interesting observation from the second graph here is that if you look at the periods in the later part, what we can see is that the expenditure growth has been much more significant compared to the revenue growth. So that's obviously a concern for us, because it indicates that going further into the future, it's going to have impact on our fiscal space. Then we can look at remittances. As you can see, remittances have increased over the years. If you look at from 2010 onwards, and over the recent months, remittances have become quite significant. If you look at the recent data, monthly data, which I have not reported here, what we can note is that in the first 7 months of 2021, we have received about $470 million. And that's compared to $384 million in the first 7 months of 2020. So you see, remittances have become quite significant during this difficult economic time. Another important observation that we can make is that there has been a significant growth in the amount of funds that have been transferred through mobile network operators. So I think remittances going forward can provide some level of support towards consumption spending, and to some level it can stimulate economic activity. Over the period 2019-2020, remittances have grown about 21%. So that's quite interesting to note here. If you look at export growth has not been so significant. In fact, export growth has somewhat moderated towards the end of 2020. And if you look at the early data for 2021, the growth in export has not been that significant. So I think looking forward, if you look at the growth process, it's going to be not very straightforward, and it depends upon a number of factors which may not essentially be economic factor in fact. So I'll talk about briefly on the national budget. If you look at the recent budget that has been brought in by the government, there are a number of assumptions. One is the budgetary support from abroad. So that is quite essential. Budgetary support from abroad is essential for the government to spend areas in which it wants to. And if we don't receive that budget support, then it can have serious implications on the government's ability to spend. Now, another factor that we need to bring in here is the revival of tourism and opening of borders. And the question that one might pose here, how likely is this going to happen? Because then if you look at it, that is one of the external factors here. the decision to open up borders and allow tourists to come from Australia and New Zealand is not only going to depend upon the Fijian government. So, it depends upon the decision of the Australian government and New Zealand government and other external factors. Another important consideration here is the asset sales. If you look at some recent studies that have been done, if you look at some research that has been published in Development Policy blog, asset sales do not always materialize. So I think we need to be cautious here. And one very important thing which I want to point out here is that the government needs to be very transparent in terms of asset sales. And it needs to be very transparent in which sectors in which the asset sales are being taken. Fiscal discipline is absolutely essential given that we have limited fiscal space. And I'll talk about the implications for the state-owned enterprises. So if you look at the assumptions, some of the ideas that have been put into the budget, I mean, one is ideally, forced to think, are we being realistic? And this is where a number of questions are supposed to be raised regarding the extent to which we are able to assure ourselves that we're going to get budgetary support from abroad, how well we are able to open up borders and revive the tourism industry, and of course, whether the asset sales are going to materialize. So I'll now talk about some of the good things in the budget. We have seen a notable allocation in the health sector and for the defense and security. So I think the good thing about this budget is that the amount of allocation towards the health, defense, and security seems quite appropriate because the government needs to spend money on the health sector, on defense and security. That is quite essential. So the health system is able to, be resilient in face of this pandemic. We are able to address the challenges that arise as a result of changes in the COVID situation. What does this budget mean for the poor and the vulnerable? We can see notable allocations in the budget regarding the poor and the vulnerable. We have about allocation of about 145.5 million to the social welfare. So we have significant allocations towards these things such as child protection allowance, elderly and disability, social pension, poverty benefit schemes. So these schemes by the government should assist the poor. However, I would want to mention that due to the pandemic, a lot of things have changed as to how the poor have been affected. And it's very useful for the government, for the relevant ministry to do an in-depth study as to find out how these schemes have been effective in terms of assisting the poor and the vulnerable. So that is very, very essential. Another important part of the budget is to do with the business sector. Okay, the government has allocated about $200 million towards revival of the business sector. And it's very appropriate for us to question whether the budget is able to address some of the existing challenges for the business sector. So there's a research that was done by Bureau of Stats sometimes I think this year, and the report is available on the Bureau website, COVID business impact in Fiji. And some of the challenges that the report identified were shortage, high cost of raw materials, lower local and international demand. So even though the government is saying we are giving $200 million to revive the business sector, we need to think whether giving those funds to the business sector will actually effectively address some of these challenges. And if they're not able to address challenges, that could probably a bit drag down growth. I want to briefly talk about social protection here. And I think it's very, very important for the government to realize that an average taxpayer expects unconditional social support. So no jab policy is somewhat bit controversial. And I think the government needs to adopt a more comprehensive or more holistic approach in terms of getting people vaccinated. What I mean by that is, even though you can get people vaccinated through legal means, we need to resort to more incentive-based approach. And this is where the private sector needs to come in. They can provide not necessarily monetary, but they can provide non-monetary incentives for their employees to get vaccinated. this is where community leaders can come in. They can encourage individuals to get vaccinated. So getting vaccinated is going to be very complicated for few individuals. Why? Because everyone's concerned about what's going inside their body, right? So everyone loves the body. So it's a very personal issue. And I think going to get people vaccinated entirely through legal means can be quite controversial. So we need to take an incentive-based approach and encourage people to get vaccinated through non-legal means as well. One area that we need to seriously explore, I think, is the reform of the government statutory bodies. I would want to mention that, because of this pandemic, a lot of things have changed. How we go and buy things, how we go about doing business. And the question for the government is, how do these statutory bodies are now going to function, provide services, go about doing their business, given that we now know that the public debt is significantly high. As of June 2021, public debt stood at about 80%, right? So for the next few months, we can expect public debt to increase further. And if our economic activity doesn't pick up, GDP doesn't pick up, then we can expect significant rise in public debt. So that would imply significant fiscal pressure. And that means the government now needs to ask the statutory bodies to be more efficient, to be more effective. They have to re-examine the entire business operation, the entire model as to how they are dealing with customers, how they're going providing services, and there's more demand for efficiency and effectiveness. Another important thing which I think many individuals are not able to understand is that this is not like a economic crisis that we had due to the global financial crisis. This is essentially a health crisis leading to an economic crisis, right? So unless we are able to take care of the health crisis, there is no way we can address the economic crisis that we are facing, right? Now, just as a result of this, the health crisis, what has happened is it has led to significant uncertainty regarding spending, consumer spending, regarding investment, regarding labor market conditions, uncertainty regarding international economic conditions and opening of international borders. So the problem here is uncertainty. And this uncertainty has led to so much of information failure, which has made it very difficult for individuals to go out and spend money, because you don't know whether tomorrow you're going to have a job or not. Firms cannot go out and spend money on their business projects because they don't know whether the demand for the products will be there in the future or not. So there's so much of uncertainty. And that's why I bring you guys to the second point, that the major challenge is to address uncertainty and restore confidence. And that is one of the key factors that will support economic recovery for Fiji. Now, how do you address uncertainty? How do you restore confidence? I emphasize on two factors here. One is efficient flow of relevant and correct information. This is in regards to asset sales. This is in regards to fiscal policy. This is in regards to the COVID situation. There needs to be efficient flow of relevant and correct information. There needs to be transparency. So this can facilitate effective planning, monitoring, and basis of that, we are able to restore confidence.
Thank
Now,
you, Janesh. We're at time. So if you just want to wrap up in the next few seconds, then we'll squeeze in a question and wrap up for now.
So a few seconds there?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would want to emphasize this need for development partners to work together with the civil society organizations to more effectively assist the poor and the vulnerable. Okay. So if you look at macroeconomic recovery, it can depend upon a number of factors. It depends upon the extent to which we are able to support e-commerce. We're able to invest in health and ICT infrastructure. That's very, very important. And of course, compliance by the business and the public sector. That's very, very, very essential, because that will improve the confidence of the international community. So macroeconomic recovery over the next few years will be best conditional. We restore confidence by getting 100% of the eligible people fully vaccinated, improve compliance, invest in health and ITC infrastructure, support e-commerce, and that's going to restore confidence. Challenges includes the external environment.
We're gonna have to leave it there, Janesh. We are at the end. So if you want to just get the last slide up for everyone to read over while we progress through, maybe that can be how we finish it up. One last invitation for any questions or comments. Still, I'm not seeing any hands or any fresh questions in the comment box, so I'll leave that open for a few seconds. I'll maybe give it a 5-second count. Any hands? Any posts? 5, 4. Oh, there's one. Who is that?
Okay.
It's Steve. Oh, Stephen. Thank you.
If you don't mind if I ask another question.
Go.
I just wanted to ask about the remittances. I mean, that finding that remittances have actually been very strong has been around for a while, and it's kept on going, which is very interesting. But we never know, is it that remittances are actually strong in total, or is it that just they've shifted from being informal to the formal sector? People used to carry the remittances home with them. Now they can't travel, so they have to put it through the formal sector. I don't know, we were never able to work that out. I just wonder whether you've had any insight into that issue. That seems to always bug this kind of research on remittances under COVID.
Can you come again, please?
No, sorry. Just saying, like you were saying, remittances are very strong, right?
Yeah.
Are you able to tell whether they've just increased in, like people in overseas are feeling bad for people back home, so they're sending more? Or is it just instead of taking money home with them when they visit, they now can't visit, so they have to send it through the formal system? Is there any way, do you think we'll ever be able to answer that question?
Well, if you look at the monthly data that we have from Reserve Bank, it seems that a lot of individuals are getting funds through personal transfers. And I guess you have a community of sister, so the cultural society is such that, you know, we can always call someone in Australia and New Zealand and ask for funds. So I think that is effectively happening in this case. And going further, as I can say that there's a need to explore how personal remittances can effectively support, you know, macroeconomic recovery. But again, it's very difficult to regulate what people do what people do with the funds that they've got from overseas. So it's a totally different area of work that possibly can be explored. Maybe my co-authors would want to contribute.
Well, we are almost at time. Russell, would you like to offer a question or a comment?
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Janesh, for a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask about the policy specifically on the lending sector. So you mentioned that the government is going to have private sector policies. Will some of that be encouraging international or domestic banks to lend more for the recovery, say to SME? Or what are the policies in that sector?
Yeah, thank you. What we have noted in the budget, the government has allocated, $200 million, and that's to support revival of the business sector. The problem here is that, you know, when you're giving funds, that may not necessarily address all the challenges that the business sector is facing. And for example, if you look at the recent report on the business sector, one of the factors there is reduced domestic and international demand. Now, so that is something that's beyond our control. So I would say allocating $200 million for business revival is a good step. It's supportive, but it may not necessarily address all the challenges that we are facing. So it's only part of the solution that we have there. Yeah.
Thank you. With that, we're just about at time. I'll just flag some interesting comments from Marita in the chat, which you guys may like to get back to her privately on afterwards. In particular, noting the limited role that the private sector banks have been playing and the compliance costs in tourism. But that said, yeah, we are at time. And this is the end of the second day of the 2021 Pacific Update. So a huge thank you to our three presenters for their talks and for all of you for joining us online at home, wherever you happen to be. I very much hope you can join us for our third day tomorrow, when we'll be discussing agriculture and health, after we kick off with a pretty exciting keynote. That keynote will be from ANU's Dr. Maru Shiel, and she's going to present on COVID-19 in the Pacific, where to from here. Maru's been very active in the Pacific response with various national governments and has a lot of interesting insights on those matters. So I do hope you can join us tomorrow, and thanks again for joining us today. I'll see you then.